So for those of you that don't know me, I co-founded Equal Rights Institute about 3.5 years ago with my brother Josh. And my job as the director of training is basically to make sure that our content is as good as it can be, whether that's our blog posts, our podcasts, our online course, or even our speeches. I want to tell you about a recurring interaction between me and Josh that's been happening ever since we started the ERI. Here's how it goes. 5 steps. The first step is I write a blog post. The second step is someone makes a comment under it. Third, I ignore that comment, of course. Fourth step, Josh politely asks, begs, or pleads, or eventually orders me, please sometimes respond to comments. And then step 5, I'll grudgingly give in. We want our blog to grow. Josh would say that that's important. If you want your blog to grow, you got to interact with comments. But you got to understand my distaste for talking to people on the internet goes back a very, very long way. But it's about 6 months ago I broke this sequence. I wrote a blog post and someone commented with some respectful, interesting questions. And so I decided I can do this, and so I started interacting with her. Josh even sent me a message on GChat, and he was like, oh, look at you talking to someone on the internet without being told to. But unfortunately, this person became like the most obnoxious person in the universe very, very quickly. Like, you know the type. This person like really got under my skin. Like I was like really upset for a while. This is so annoying. Taking what I was saying out of context, very, very frustrating experience. And so I gave up talking to her, and I told Josh, I don't ever want to talk to anyone on the internet ever again. Less than 30 minutes later, Josh gets a phone call from Tina Whittington at Students for Life of America, inviting us both to speak at this conference, and she wanted me to speak about how to talk to people on the internet. Go figure. So I tell that story not just for the sheer irony of it, I promise. I want to use this story to contrast what my actual view is from what would be very easy to think my view is from that true story. I honestly don't think that everyone should just abandon social media. There's a lot of good that we can do on social media by advocating for the unborn, by raising awareness about pro-life things that are going on, and even sometimes by dialoguing with people online. People do change their minds in online interactions. But it's a very, very difficult thing to do well. So what I want to do is I want to explain some of the obstacles that make it really hard to do this well, and then I'll give 16 very practical tips really quickly so you can make the best of your opportunity if you're going to do it anyway. I want to explain a little bit about how we think about dialogue first. After analyzing the thousands and thousands of hours of interaction we've had on campus, the different members of the ERI team, we at ERI have become absolutely convinced that in order for most people to change their minds in a healthy way about anything, they have to feel emotionally safe. They have to. And I don't mean like trigger warnings, like you can't possibly offend anyone. I mean, when people are in fight mode, they can't hear you. Persuasion, in other words, is not just about the arguments you make. It doesn't matter how brilliant and smart you are. If the other person is listening to you like this, they have that kind of a fighting mode posture, then they can't hear you. So a lot of what we're doing in our conversations, it's all non-argument things. We're asking a lot of questions. We're very intentional about the types of questions we ask. We find common ground with them a lot. We even affirm their feelings. Like, really. And doing all of these things, we're paying attention to our body language, the whole series of things that we're doing, very, very intentionally. And the cumulative effect of all of these things is bringing their shields down. When they get out of fight mode, they stop being so defensive and they become receptive. And then we see minds change. The first obstacle you face in your social media dialogues is that you're having a conversation that's public, not private. And people do not feel as emotionally safe in public as they do in private. Imagine 2 scenarios for me. The first scenario, your close friend comes to you privately and tells you that they think you have an anger problem. The second scenario, your friend approaches you in exactly the same way. They use exactly the same words, the same tone, everything, except they do it at the dinner table in front of your friends and family. How's that sound? Unless you're a bona fide saint with like 3 documented miracles, you're going to find it a lot harder to keep your cool in this situation. Because when there's people around, we've got reputation to defend. And that makes us defensive. Another obstacle is definitely related, but is very clearly independent from the public versus private thing, which is that the nature of social media is to force you to think constantly about your own image. Like, you can't help it. You're thinking about questions like, what kind of picture should I have on my social media? Well, I want pictures where I look really good, like where I look attractive, or maybe the kind of picture that's going to demonstrate to people that I'm like popular and well-liked. or maybe you're the kind of person that's like embraced that you're a nerd and that's like kind of part of your thing, and so you post nerdy things a lot. We're all doing brand management on social media. And so we're constantly in that kind of a mindset whenever we log in. We cannot help it. We're all doing brand management. And part of that brand management is things like the pictures, but also the kinds of statuses that we make or the posts that we write. Those statuses are going to be consistent with the kind of image that we want people to see us as. So for instance, if you really want people to see you as a really respectable, spiritual person, then you're going to give some indications, some subtle, some that you think are subtle, but I promise you are really not, that you're a really respectable, spiritual person. By the way, this is called virtue signaling. I wish I had more time to talk about this. I just recently wrote an article on it called On Virtue Signaling that everyone in this room needs to read. Ask Amanda. We printed out 20 copies of it, so for the first 20 people who asked for it at our booth, they have a printed copy. But everyone needs to read this. The basic gist of the problem, though, just so you're aware, is that every time you log into social media, you are back in the place, the environment where your mind is the most zeroed in on what your image is. And that just makes you more defensive. Next obstacle. The structure of social media comments does you no favors when you're trying to have a productive dialogue. I'll give you a couple of examples of why. One is you've got this kind of like the horns of a dilemma. How long is your comment? No one likes reading big walls of text. And so if you're writing big walls of text, you know what happens? They skim your comment and don't really read it. That's no good, you don't want that. But on the other hand, if you're too concise, too consistently, then people will forget what the context is because the back and forth is happening too rapidly. You're kind of stuck. There's not really a good way out of this problem. Just the nature of the way Facebook comments in particular work, you're just kind of stuck with this problem. It becomes hard for people to follow what's going on. They lose the context too quickly. Because most people, let's be honest, they're not rereading the whole thread in context when they respond to you. At best, if you're very, very lucky, they're reading the last comment or two to remind themselves what's going on, and then assuming that their memory is good enough to remember the context and everything else, and that's never the case. And so you end up with this problem where conversations go off the rails almost immediately. Another problem, this really bothers me, this is there's so many things that bother me, like a competition for the most frustrating thing is a tough competition, it's the cage match. This is very, very high on the list for me these days, which is that the way the like system works creates a really unfair imbalance in arguments. You can be doing a great job. You're being really, really gracious, really clear, you're being appropriately concise, you're making the best arguments. But if your pro-choice friend is willing to play a little dirty, they can call in all their pro-choice buddies, and they're clicking like on all their comments. And to any casual observer, they're noticing, oh, there's this argument between this pro-choice person and this pro-life person. The pro-choice person, man, people seem to think they're really reasonable. They've got 9 likes on all their posts, and you've got nothing. And because of that, it's not fair, it's not reasonable, but just the way our psychology works, the people just casually reading these posts are going to assume you're probably the less reasonable one, and they're going to read what you say, even those reasonable things that you're saying, through that filter. And so even if you're doing it perfectly, things can completely go wrong. Another problem. People on social media are almost completely immune to appropriate social pressures. So in an on-campus dialogue, this is a thing that I do a lot. I'm talking to someone, we're having a good conversation initially, and they start getting kind of obnoxious. I can say, hey, I've been really respectful to you. We've been having a really good conversation. I've been really nice to you. But if you're going to make those kinds of snarky comments, I'm just going to find someone else to talk to. That's not okay. And you might think that would just cause people to get mad at me, but most of the time, they respond by apologizing profusely, and they completely change their behavior. And the reason for that is because we're having a human interaction, and I am tapping into their conscience by giving them an appropriate kind of social pressure. And they respond to that, and they don't want to be that person, and so they change their behavior. But online, people are immune to that social pressure. If you say, hey, that was really rude what you just said, the most natural response on social media, I'm sorry, it just is what it is screw you, you're the one that's being rude. And now the conversation devolves into who is rude first. And believe me, that's never helpful. It never gets anywhere. Similarly, if you say something like, man, what you just said really offended me. On social media, the most natural response is we're not having a human interaction, is to say, grow up, snowflake, don't be so sensitive. When you're in person, you've got this face-to-face human interaction, and that connects to their conscience in a natural way. On social media, all they're seeing is your profile picture. And just the way our minds work, they kind of tune it out. They get used to it, and they just treat you like this avatar of whatever your view is. and they don't treat you like a human. They dehumanize you, and you dehumanize them. We can't help it. We can try really hard to push against it, but it's an inevitable part of the social media interaction. A couple more obstacles. The next one is a man named Donald J. Trump. I don't care what your opinion is of President Trump. I don't care if you like him or hate him or somewhere in the middle. That's not the point. The point is that objectively, obviously, he makes social media dialogue harder. This is true on campus sometimes. It's especially true on Facebook and Twitter. Because President Trump makes people very, very angry. And so when people are all angry and stirred up, they find it harder to be reasonable and interact with you in a reasonable way. President Trump identifies as pro-life. You identify as pro-life. They hate him with every fiber of their being. And so some of that hatred of Trump kind of slides over to you because you have this thing in common. You both identify as pro-life. This does not work in our favor. This isn't the only reason why social media dialogue is so much worse now than it was 2 years ago, but it is definitely part of it. One more obstacle. This is kind of related. Social media, in general, just the way it's structured, is an engine for constant outrage. People are angry all the time, and they can't help it. The part of the way this works is most people on social media, like your followers or Facebook friends, it's just part of who we are. We like confirmation bias. You wind up with friends that generally agree with you. So take your average leftist friend just as an example. I don't want to pick on leftists, but it's a good example. Your average leftist friend, they can't stand Trump. Trump just makes their heads explode every time he says anything. And most of their friends feel similarly. And so every time President Trump does anything that could possibly be interpreted negatively, which, let's be honest, every day, someone's going to share a post about how terrible President Trump is, and it's going to show up in the newsfeed, and they're going to share it, and they're going to talk about it, and they're just stirred up and angry all the time, and they get angrier and angrier. And sometimes they interact with Trump supporters who are so stubborn they'll just follow him right off a cliff, and it makes them crazy, and they're exasperated, they're so tense, and then you show up and you lovingly say, hey, you want to talk about abortion? They are not capable, oftentimes, of having a friendly conversation about abortion with you on social media because they have been conditioned to be angry every time they log in. They can't help it. When you put all of those things together, and that's just a couple of examples, I could go on, you end up with an incredibly hostile environment for productive dialogue. I promise in a couple of minutes I'm going to run through my practical tips so those of you that are going to do this anyway, which I assume is most of you, can make the best of this opportunity. But first, let me just take a couple of minutes and ask you to do a self-check sometime in the next couple of days. Take 5 quiet minutes to yourself and ask yourself honestly if social media is a net positive in your life. I'm not saying everyone needs to get off. I promise. There are good things about social media. There's things that I love about social media. I love seeing engagement announcements and baby photos, all that stuff. That's awesome. I love that I can stay in touch with people that I really care about, but I'm not so close I'm going to talk to them on the phone all the time. But I can still kind of keep in touch. That's awesome. I promise there's wonderful things about social media. And I love silly cat videos just as much as the next guy. But Facebook and Twitter, these social media platforms, for many of us, is an epic drain on our time. So if in the next few days you have kind of a self-check, I want you to ask a couple of specific questions. Here's the first one. Ask yourself if you're religious, if you would be uncomfortable answering to God for the amount of time that you waste on social media. If you're not religious, then you think that this life is all you've got. Is this a good use of that time? The second question is, are you happy with the kind of person you are on social media? Does it feed into your personal vices of being self-obsessed or stubborn or arrogant about your intelligence or something like this? Does it feed into your vices? Facebook turns me into the worst version of myself when I'm trying to have a discussion. And I think it turns a lot of us into the worst version of ourselves. If I was the devil and I was trying to come up with some kind of an environment where people could waste an incredible amount of time being self-obsessed and belligerent and not be able to talk to each other, I don't know if I could do better than Facebook and Twitter. It's amazing. It's almost like it was, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's interesting how bad it is. Let me say this. I really want us to save babies. I think that there's a lot of good that we can do on social media. But I don't want you to make yourself a worse person in order to save babies. That is not your job. It's not worth filling you with vice. So if you have a personal problem with being obsessed with your own image, then it might be that you should invest in some face-to-face activism. Like, you want to put your pro-life time somewhere? Put it in the kind of place that's going to help you be a better person. If you have a problem with being really arrogant about your intelligence, that's some of us in this room, I'm not going to name any names, then it might not be that good for you to spend your activism time debating abortion. If it's a real problem, maybe not even in person. Like, maybe what you should do is spend that time like getting some counseling or pastoral help or something and work on that problem and do a more humble means of activism in the meantime. Go to your local PRC and say, hey, I'm a pair of hands and I just want to help. It is a lot more fun and it is a lot easier to debate abortion on Facebook than it is to scrub toilets at your local PRC. But if you're active in the pro-life movement for the fun of it, then you've really lost sight of what we're doing here. All right, sermon over. That's all I got. If you're going to do this anyway, there's 16 things that you can do that are going to make you much more successful at it. I'm going to run through them quickly so we can do lots of Q&A. Number 1, this is the granddaddy tip. All of the other tips depend on this tip. This is it. Move your conversation to private message, Skype, or in person as soon as possible. Again, it's easy to think from the kinds of things that I'm saying and like from my opening story that I just hate social media and everything about it. No, I'm willing to admit the good things about social media. And one of the great things about social media is it's an awesome place to start a conversation. It's a terrible place to have the rest of it. But it's a great place to start the conversation. So here's what you do. You write a Facebook post or send out a tweet and ask a pretty narrow question. And then you get people to respond to that, and you don't have the whole conversation right there in public where they're all defensive and their shields are up. You private message them and say, hey, that was really interesting what you said. Let me ask you another question. And then cultivate that relationship, and then eventually, hey, could we Skype and talk about it? If you can't get together in person? Much better use of Facebook. Number 2, this is related. Make very minimal persuasion goals, at least until you're one-on-one. So don't be the guy who's like, I'm going to have a 200-comment argument on abortion with anyone that wants to talk to me. Because there's only one other person reading those comments, and that's the person you're arguing with, and it would be more persuasive to them if you did it privately. It's not a good use of time. And it becomes too complicated. Like those kinds of threads, you wind up in all kinds of different areas, and people just can't focus. So on social media, minimal persuasion goals. Here's what you should do. You should say, here's a pro-life argument that I think has some merit. Or here's a pro-choice argument that I often hear, and I think it's wrong. I think it doesn't have that much merit. And focus on just that argument. And people are going to always be like, oh yeah, well, what about bodily rights? What about the back alleys? Like, okay, let's talk about that tomorrow. Try to stay focused in your conversation. Make minimal persuasion goals. Number 3, this one's from Josh. Be aware of the lack of nonverbal communication. So I've heard people say things like 90% of communication is nonverbal. I don't really believe that. That seems a little bit extreme. But certainly a lot of it is. And on Facebook and like social media, you don't have access to that. And that makes it a lot harder. Again, like so much of persuasion is about non-argument stuff, and you just can't manage those things on social media. It's such a problem. So do the best that you can. Use emoticons. Use emojis. Like try to be friendly. Go out of your way to be friendly. Think of the way that you're interacting with them the way that you actually are trying to. Number 4, also from Josh. Post things with pro-choice people in mind. If it's going to make your pro-life friends go, yeah, woo! And it's going to make your pro-choice friends think that you're an uncharitable jerk not worth talking to, it's not worth posting it. And that's not just true of things that you post, it's true of things you like. If your friend posts a pro-life article and you agree with the arguments in it, but the writer is a jerk, and they're uncharitable and they strawman the pro-choice position, don't click like on it. Because if you do, and it's going to show up in your timeline or in someone else's newsfeed, the pro-choice friend's going to see that you like that piece, and they're going to think that that's representative of what you believe. And they're going to write you off as someone not worth talking to. It's not worth it. Post and like things with pro-choice people in mind. Number 5, try very, very hard to assume the best about people. The entire environment of social media turns us away from this. Mentally, try to remind yourself to talk to them the way that you would in person. Number 6, and this one from ERI trainer Rachel Crawford. This is very important. Take a step back if you're feeling defensive. This is going to happen. It's okay. You might feel like you've lost the argument because now you're just kind of like not responding to the last thing they said. It's okay because you'll never respond to the last thing that they said on Facebook because there's always another comment. If you're feeling defensive, if this is turning you into a vicious person, an unvirtuous person, it's not worth it. Take a step back. Another one from Josh. Point out virtually every case of common ground. I am frustrated about how some pro-life people are jerks. I am too. It's important to agree with people, find genuine common ground in any conversation. Online, it's especially important. Number 8, try to only use neutral language. If there's ever a time where it's a good use of your conversation time to argue with the pro-choice person about whether or not they're pro-choice or pro-abortion, I promise you, it's not in your Facebook argument, not the right time. Number 9, ask lots of respectful, clarifying questions, and make few statements or arguments. At least until you're having a one-on-one dialogue. One-on-one is way better for making statements and arguments. Spend a lot of your time asking clarifying questions. That's how you get the conversation started. Number 10, another excellent one from Josh. Choose a friendly-looking profile pic. Again, now sometimes people are just going to kind of tune out your profile picture. They're not going to be thinking about it. But sometimes they're going to notice it, and it's going to affect the conversation. If your profile pic is like a pro-life meme, like I like some pro-life memes. If it's your profile pic, that's going to tell pro-choice people you're a stubborn crusader, and it's like not as nice an environment for them to talk to you. So just don't do that if you're planning on trying to dialogue with pro-choice people. Number 11, don't name drop philosophers' theories. Please don't name drop logical fallacies or any other technical language. It's not inviting. It comes across as really arrogant. Sometimes there are places where it's appropriate, and in a one-on-one conversation you can get away with it. If you're having a public Facebook argument, avoid it at all costs. Number 12, don't feed the trolls. Everyone knows what that means. You're already in dialogue wasteland. It's not a good use of your time to engage with people that just kind of want to mess with you and waste your time. By the way, if people start being trollish to you, they're being rude, and so because of that you're going to disengage, don't argue with them about whether or not they're being trollish. They will argue with you until the sun burns out of energy, which NASA estimates to be, like 5 billion years from now. They will not stop. It's a waste of time. If they're being trollish, you don't have to convince them that they're being trollish to be justified in leaving. Just move on. Number 13, another good practical one from Josh. Use links very sparingly. You need to assume in your argument that the only thing they're going to read is what you write, and only if you're concise enough. You can't be like, here, watch this video of a pro-life speaker. It's an hour long, and that'll prove my point for me. No, you got to do the work for yourself. Don't be lazy. On that subject, number 14, only cite neutral websites for sources. Don't cite pro-life sites. It's not going to come across as neutral. Number 15, this is a great one from Josh. Point out when they teach you something. I want to tell you why this is so important. This is true in in-person conversations. It's true of online conversations. People match your behavior. So if you demonstrate humility by saying, hey, I'd never learned that before. I never thought about that before. That's really helpful to me. Thank you for telling me that. But they're a lot more likely to kind of reflect your humility back to you. And if they learn something from you, they'll be more likely to say that. And you end up with this like positive cycle. On the other hand, if you get all defensive and snarky, they're going to match that too. People tend to match your behavior. And so call them to a higher standard and model the humility. And finally, number 16, sow intentional, positive seeds with people you would hope to dialogue with one day. Josh had a really good idea of a specific way to do this, which is to click like on the other person's comments, even when you don't agree with it. Click like on it if you appreciate their candor, if you appreciate how polite they're being, how clear they're being, how charitable they're being to the other side. You can disagree with their conclusion and still like their comment. That's like hey, sorry, like I appreciate you kind of a move. I'm a very big fan of calling out and acknowledging anytime they exhibit any kind of virtue. If they indicate open-mindedness, praise them for it. If they are willing to say, yeah, I'm pro-choice, for some reason pro-choice people always get this wrong. I'm really sorry. Like, thank you for saying that. And that's like a really open-minded thing to say. Thank you for that. Praise them when they exhibit virtue. All that to say, your conversations are going to be a lot more likely to change minds if you're in person. If you don't know how to do in-person conversations well, shameless plug, you need to get the Equip for Life course. Clubs that take the Equip for Life course always report that they have more dialogue and they have better dialogues. It's hard enough as it is. We made this thing to help you. Today it's 25% off. Come outside to us, get the Equip for Life course, help us to take your club to the next level. Thanks.
So really my hope was to point out some things as to student groups can do that, take some great advice from Tim, but it was literally everything. I gush about him and his brother Josh all the time. They are great. You have to read their blogs. Like, if you don't, you're missing out on how to dialogue both on digital and in real life. It's phenomenal, and I agree. If you don't do social media well, just get off. And how much time do we have left?
You have.
Okay, so now's the time for Q&A. So let's start just a couple things for your student groups, yourself personally. Any questions you might have for either Tim or Josh?
I was wondering when is the appropriate time to use snark? Because I mean, there was a couple people talked about snark here, and they both seem to be opposed to each other.
That's a great question. So it's one of the reasons I like Facebook more personally than Twitter, because the character limit just makes snark rule Twitter. I think snark is very effective in debates. It's wonderful in debates. It's one of the reasons why Trent Hart is the best pro-life debater, in my opinion. He is so good at snark, and in a debate context, like whoever's funnier wins. Like that is just is a fact of nature. The way people's psychology works, the person who's funny gets like extra credibility points. It doesn't make any sense, but it's how psychology works. If you're in a debate context and you're trying to get credibility, snark is certainly very helpful. Humor is very helpful. If you're trying to lower people's shields and get them to listen to you and take your argument to heart, snark often works against you. Humor, like good-natured humor, works for you. Like, oh, like that kind of like helps. It's kind of like a gas release. Like, okay, we're laughing together. It's okay. We're not enemies. And that can be really good. But like making a joke at their expense or like snarky comment, oftentimes is not a good move. If the goal is lowering their shield and helping them change their mind. If the goal is to win the argument and have everyone think that you won the argument, snark is your best friend. Weird that it works that way, but it is.
I have a question with in regards to like liking, say for example, someone's thoughts or article that you may have posed. I guess, I mean, would that come off like strange to your viewers, for example, who see that, oh, I saw that you liked, this pro-choice article or this person?
Yeah, it might. So I think the way a lot of people naturally think about Facebook likes, it's so weird to analyze something like Facebook likes. But the way I think most people interpret that is I agree with it. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. And if that's the way that we choose to approach it, if we go along with that, then we end up with a situation where we are intentionally reinforcing tribalism. And I'm really worried about tribalism right now. Let's break down some of those barriers. And if that might confuse some of your friends. If you like the pro-choice comment that's really charitable and gracious and clear, they're like, oh, that was good. Some of your friends might be like, whoa, are you pro-choice? That's just an opportunity for you to clarify, and that's fine. It's a good question. You're identifying there's a certain kind of risk with the recommendation that I'm making, and I just think it's worth it.
I think also in that, something you could do to follow up is after you like a comment or like someone's post, clarify, like
make your own comment,
in a kind way, like this is why I'm doing this, because I understand like you're being that person being humble or charitable. It's helpful.
You can say, I disagree with your conclusion, but I love the way that you said that. And I think that can counteract some of that.
And starting over here.
Have you done any studies on like the impact of using abortion like graphic images on social media?
I haven't done any studies on that, have you?
Well, we did there's a neuromarketing study that was done early 2000s that I think actually might apply to this. And one of those is they did a study with Philip Morris. They hooked up these individuals, they wanted to skip over focus group testing, hooked up individuals to these neurotransmitters to be able to tell if they were actually telling the truth as opposed to just in a focus group, qualitative research. And so one thing that they found was that the more that they showed smokers bad things about smoking, the more it made them want to smoke. Now there might be something inherent to that is part of maybe it's just driving them to smoke or whatever. But the reality is that we tend to actually turn away. So the result of the study was we tend to turn away from graphic depictions. I think that in itself, while it's not an on-point study, I think that it is something that at least can get your mind thinking about how is showing these graphic images, is that actually turning people away and making them uncomfortable as opposed to, I'm not against them, by the way, I just think that that's something that we have to consider of if we're trying to have a debate, is it getting people to turn away?
There's a feature on Facebook in particular that works against you if you want to use graphic images, which is the unfollow feature. If your mindset is, well, if people just see the images enough times they're going to change their minds, that's a fair perspective. But on Facebook, the kind of people that you really want to see it over and over, the first time they see it, unfollow, they're never going to see it again, or anything else you ever say. So in terms of places where graphic images are going to be effective, I think that social media is not one of the most effective.
And there's also the reports button, so I
That
mean,
too.
a lot of it, most of the time, you post it, someone's gonna complain, and it's gonna go away, and then your account might be suspended.
The game is set against you from using them effectively on Facebook.
For tip number 4, I'm a Christian and a lot of my friends are Christian who are with the pro-life movement. I like sharing verses and sharing what they think to be is like a good reason to be pro-life, which is like scriptures and verses and biblical evidence, but that doesn't necessarily apply to an atheist who is pro-choice. How
Remind me what tip number 4 is. I don't have it all memorized.
you have to look in the, I think it was the one that was, you have to look in a pro-choice perspective. You can't do
Oh,
things that, like,
post people with pro-choice people in mind.
Yeah, you have to keep them in mind, and how they're going to think,
Sure.
how they're going to look at it.
So I think it's okay for you to not always post things for the pro-choice audience. Like you can say, hey, I've got a pro-life meeting tonight. Like everyone should come, we're gonna have pizza. Like you're not posting that for your pro-choice friends. But if you say, you should be in the pro-life meeting because pro-choice people are stupid, that's gonna irritate your pro-choice friends. I'm not saying only post things for the pro-choice audience, but post it with them in mind. Remember that they're gonna read it too. And so say things about the abortion issue in a way that's respectful and gracious to them, because then they're more likely to be willing to talk to you. It's okay to post a Bible verse or post a pro-life argument, but do it in a way that's not saying pro-choice people are stupid, all pro-choice arguments are dumb, like that kind of thing. That's what I mean.
Okay, is there a way to do some type of like Christian outreach without like driving them away from
Yeah.
keeping the shield up?
Just be respectful. Be respectful to the other side.
I think one thing I would just add too is that like in Tempe we have this like Mill Avenue, which is like where everyone goes and kind of hangs out. It's like a place, and so there's a street preacher there, and he's got like his bullhorn. I'm sitting there thinking like, man, I can't stand that. Like that drives me nuts. But then I see people approach him and actually start talking. And the reality is that like that doesn't appeal to me, but that appealed to somebody. And so I think part of when I say like be smart about like your purpose, like when you choose your purpose of how you want to use social media, like you may not be the type of person that's gonna like get in there and like battle with the trolls. You may be the person that rallies people together, other Christians together to pray or to engage and to do things in the community. Like you can know your purpose. And that's why I'm saying pick that out right away. Like know yourself enough to get out there and say like I'm not going to be that person to change all these people's minds, but I really do want to pray with my friends and we want to get together. That's absolutely powerful. So like just pick your purpose and get out there and do it, and then just move forward.
It's great.
I think that's all of the questions we have time for.
I'll be at my booth all day.
We'll be at booth.
Come talk to me.
Are you going to stick around?
I'll be
Go-
wandering the halls aimlessly.
Hang around the ADF booth for a while so
Yeah.
people can find both of us.